much. Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Orr and I'm sorry I was so stuck in traffic this morning not to be able to welcome you at the beginning, but here we are. I'm one of the investigators on the Queer Beyond London project and actually a slightly shadowy organiser of this conference. So I want to thank Katie Pettit in particular for doing the hard work on organising this conference, along with Justin and Matt Cook. So we've had a fantastic morning. I really enjoyed I missed the first 5 minutes, thankfully. We had some great panels this morning, and we are looking forward to the same this afternoon. Before I introduce Valerie, I want to make a really important announcement. It's important because it's about our queer locality and cakes at 4 o'clock this afternoon. We have got what's hopefully a better room than the one that's originally advertised on the printed programmes. And tea at 4 o'clock and cake will now be in the building opposite, so it's not so far away. The main building, if you come out of the front of this building and look across the square, you'll see it. If not, we'll kind of point the way. And it's room 417 in that main building. So room 417. There are various signs outside as well to remind you. Okay, well I'm got the wrong piece of paper as usual. I'm delighted to open the second half of today. With a very warm welcome to Valerie Korinek, who is giving the plenary keynote lecture for the next hour of this conference. We're delighted that Valerie was able to come from Canada to London to this conference. Valerie Korinek is the Professor of Modern Canadian History at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon in Canada. Valerie is the author of the wonderfully titled, well it's not quite out yet, but look out for Prairie Fairies, A History of Queer Communities and People in Western Canada, 1930 to 1985. It's going to be published by the University of Toronto Press next spring or summer, so within 6 months. Great. So, Prairie Fairies coming up. Valerie's particular historical expertise and renown is in the history of sexuality, gender and culture. She's published important work on feminist publishing and periodicals in Canada, and she's worked on a variety of areas in women's and feminist history and the history of sexuality. Her current research interests are particularly in food histories and studies, and she's the co-editor of Edible Histories, Cultural Politics, Towards a Canadian Food History, and that was published in 2012. And her paper in that anthology, which it looks completely fascinating, it looks at Katie Lang's coming out as a vegetarian. So the link between lesbian feminism and vegetarianism is one that has a lot of resonance across the Atlantic. Thanks very much, and I introduce you, please welcome Valerie Korinek.
Thank you, Alison. It's delightful to be here today. 10 years ago, in fact, I date myself to say that, but 10 years ago, I gave one of my first papers from what will now be the monograph project here in London at Canada House. And it was a Canadian Studies project back when the Canadian government funded Canadian Studies. So it was very posh, held at Canada House. And after I finished my talk, there was just stunned silence. So, in part because no one really knew what to expect. What did she say? She was talking about the prairies and homosexuality. Great. So it's delightful to be here today at a conference like this one. In fact, it's very heartwarming to be part of a conference where not only is everybody speaking my own language, but we're all hearing about particular localities. I want to thank Allison and Matt and Justin, and above all, Katie, for your fantastic work on this conference. I've never felt so welcomed and so attended to, even at distance, via email. So I want to thank you for that. It's been a wonderful invitation, and so far it's been an absolutely exciting time to be here. So I want to make one more quick introductory comment about the importance of this work, but also to give you a little snippet, I think, into the lot of a Canadian historian researching cities in Western Canada and the way in which perhaps the world doesn't quite understand this. So a few years ago I sent a paper on Winnipeg off to an American journal, and I got a very interesting response to it, which was, suffice to say, basically, we've heard about London and San Francisco and even Buffalo. What on earth could we need to know about Winnipeg, Manitoba for? So with your indulgence, I'm going to explain what I need to know about Winnipeg, Manitoba. In mid-1977, can everyone hear me at the back?
Yes.
Perfect. In mid-1977, the cover of After Stonewall, a critical journal of prairie gay liberation, produced in Winnipeg, Manitoba, proclaimed that the prairies were coming out strong. Further, the editorial collective wrote, "The prairie provinces of Canada may not have big gay communities, but we have a particular outlook on gay liberation, which we believe to be just as valuable and just as much part of gay life as that of Toronto, Montreal, New York, or San Francisco." The collective consisted of 6 men, 3 Canadians, 2 Americans, and 1 expat Brit, who were students, professionals, and activists, age 18 to 30. In their opinion, quote, "gays must work together on a North America-wide basis and ultimately internationally." And so their perspective, their ideological and political perspective was crossing borders, transnational. After Stonewall's, there's a couple more covers for you to look at. After Stonewall's views of Western queer activism served to stimulate debate, accentuate Western Canadian particularities, but it also tied the West to a larger international gay activist politics. I'm going to talk about that today. This periodical and others drew upon nearly a decade of organized gay and lesbian social and political activities within the Prairie region, not to mention same-sex Indigenous activities in the Western region that predates European settlement. So just to show you 2 quick images here for what is a large topic, a huge one, beyond the scope of my paper today. But the one on the left is a recruitment poster aimed at European immigrants, English and Northern European immigrants, welcoming you to fruitful Manitoba. They were not at all coy about using these fertility metaphors, not only to invoke the richness of the land, but also what they hoped that European settlers would do in Western Canada is that they would populate what was then thought of as an immense, open, empty space of land. The other little picture, which is actually really, really interesting, comes from a commemorative book about Winnipeg. For those of you at the back who can't read it, I'll read what the little description says. It says, "Point Douglas before the hookers." So sexuality is a well-inscribed part of the Western Canadian experience. So this is what I would now say to the stunned silence that met me at Canada House, is to say, remember folks, it's all about sex in Western Canada, and that includes same-sex activity. So today I'm going to draw upon a wealth of oral, archival, and cultural histories. And this research is part of a transnational historical project to rewrite urban and social histories with queer actors at their core. So as Allison has already mentioned, today's lecture is drawn from my forthcoming monograph, Prairie Fairies. And in that research, I've benefited from an extensive historical literature on queer urban histories, starting with foundational work on New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and London, as well as a theoretical framework that includes historical and cultural geography, and of course, queer theory. More recently, as many academics have rediscovered, queer women and men were not only urban, coastal, and metropolitan, but they were also Midwestern and Southern, rural and small town. Critiquing the metronormativity, his word of the field, J. Jack Halberstam and other scholars have insisted that academics not dismiss those rural, small town, and small city queers as, quote, left behind, or unwilling to embark on the transformative potential of migration to a queer metropolis. Because it was not just in the queer metropolis that people could be transformed into openly queer, liberated actors. The Canadian contributions to this transnational history of sexuality's literature are dynamic, but the Canadian field remains much, much smaller. Until recently, it's largely been confined to publications focused on Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. Now, my research owes obviously a sizable debt to those earlier studies. Yet in my own work, close attention to regional queer presses, extensive oral histories, gay and lesbian clubs, and activist organizations has enabled a distinctive history to emerge. To summarize briefly, in my research I argue that a regional history of queer people living and loving in the prairie provinces from the 1930s through the mid-1980s offers a number of important contributions to histories of sexuality and gender, and more specifically Western Canada. And I really try to bridge in my own work not only histories of sexuality and gender, but the home region in which it's situated and from which I write. So there on the left is a map. Those are Canada's prairie provinces. And you'll see the smaller cutout map below, or the full map of Canada below. So just to situate ourselves, we're in the prairies. We're not talking about British Columbia today. Many people consider BC to be part of Western Canada, and of course it is, but it is not part of the prairie provinces. So in the first instance, my research conclusively demonstrates that queer people carved out spaces for socializing, community building, and activism within the prairies. And the book, obviously, from the 30s through the 80s, covers a much broader terrain. I won't be talking very much about the earlier work prior to 1969, but if you have questions in the question period, I'll happily entertain those. Most urban histories of sexual community formation, activism, or identity focus solely on one city. So this multi-city regional analysis of queer life in the Canadian prairies is quite unique, whether we're talking about Canada or we're talking about internationally. I now realize, I was joking with Alison about this a little earlier this morning, I now realize that I should have put a team project together to do it. The reason it's taken me is a decade is because I've done these cities myself. So next time around, team project is the way to go. Within the field of Canadian prairie history, this work challenges the overwhelmingly heteronormative focus and shifts the gauge from the majority to the margins. A regional approach better captures migrations within the region as women and men moved from farms, small towns, and smaller cities into the larger cities as they sought out educational opportunities, employment, and sexual opportunities. They also moved from the north to the south, and that's an important piece of this study as well. My research has conclusively disproved the impression, largely one of conjecture and stereotype, that all queer people, particularly those with initiative and drive, moved away from the prairies, while those who stayed were, quote, closeted or left behind. People chose to move, regionally or outside the region, but they often chose to stay. This third path, moving within the region to a larger city with queer resources, people, and activities, allowed people to fashion queer lives. In Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary, and Regina, varied spaces, mixed-use bars, cruising areas, membership clubs, community centers, cultural and sporting groups, religious groups, and activism proved highly attractive. The slide, for those of you unfamiliar with Winnipeg, is the Manitoba Legislature. On the top of the legislature is a gold statue called Golden Boy. I will show you an image of him, an artistic rendition of him later on. But the Golden Boy is effectively the signpost to queer cruising in the city of Winnipeg. And so this is what it would look like at night on the banks of the river there. So affordable car travel is one of the key prerequisites of admission into this group, and a culture of road trips, a sense of regional interconnectedness fostered by gay and lesbian periodicals, newsletters, and conferences further stimulated this network of regional queer possibility. It's clear from the newsletters, conferences, and organizational minutes that not only were prairie people networking and moving within the region, they were also contributing to national gay activism and organizational discussions, and this is also very important. Those residents of large Canadian queer communities were very familiar with their Western Canadian peers. Activists from Ontario and British Columbia wrote about them in the national gay news magazine, The Body Politic, which was produced out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. They attended cultural events in Saskatoon, and other regional and Canadian national gay lesbian activist conferences were held annually from 73 to 1980, and Western participants were at all of those. And these are images from two of the marches that occurred during two of those Western Canadian conferences. Now, what has been lost in the decades since the national conferences ended, and because there is such a large gap in our histories of contemporary queer politics, is how interconnected the national scene actually was with the West. There were tensions, to be sure, in political approaches, and in particular about gender inclusivity. Above all else, there were tensions about who was able to define and strategize who got to speak as a national activist. Western voices were strong, and some articulated a different vision for activism, whether it was the no-compromise vision of the After Stonewall crew, or the more moderate but nonetheless proud regional perspective offered by Saskatchewan Gay Coalition and their periodical Grassroots, and I'll give you some examples of their material in a minute. Other queer activists had worked extensively with their Ontario counterparts, so Western Canadians went to and contributed to the Lesbian and Gay Archives in Toronto. They wrote for and were part of the Body Politic Collective in Toronto. And they were also moving to Toronto and Ottawa, which would tend to have two of the largest gay organizations in the country, because these people traveled to Toronto quite frequently. But there were also interconnections between these groups, because some of the individuals who contributed in Toronto and Ottawa, and also in Vancouver to a lesser extent, were transplanted prairie people, and this is very important. Prairie people get around. It's important in the Canadian context, then, to pay attention to regional contributions and voices within the national gay movement, because the Canadian gay movement was never as large nor as organized as the American national lesbian and gay activist movement was, nor as well funded. Miriam Smith has argued that the national movement in Canada was never more than a set of loose networks, not a coherent actor. And thus that amplifies how important local queer organizations were to not only contributing to their activities, but actually creating dialogue and discussion. The Prairie's thriving activist scenes in Winnipeg and Saskatoon in particular would play an important role at generating local activism and contributing to the national liberationist dialogue. Westerners played a more significant role than earlier historical works would have acknowledged, including that Western activist groups hosted 3 of the 8 national gay and lesbian conferences. Gay liberationist strategies and tactics continued to be articulated and utilized in Western Canada well into the 1980s. So research into Western Canadian liberation activism indicates that these activists were inspired by and aware of American developments, but differed from them in important ways that I will tease out a little bit in the lecture. So turning now to some of the key questions. What was it like to be gay, lesbian, or queer in the prairies? How did people organize their lives? How did they create organizations, social spaces, and activism? Was it more difficult or dangerous to be queer in Alberta? How did lesbians and gay men interact? In my work, Prairie Fairies, I illustrate that being queer in the prairies, the context, the individual initiative of the people in question, and the city and regional setting affected the outcomes quite dramatically. There were 2 distinct eras, one pre-1970, in which queer activity was largely subcultural, where queer people made spaces where they could, converting tables, corners of bars, men's washrooms, parks, and house parties into queer space. Jens Helquist, who would be a founder of many of Saskatoon's gay social and activist spaces, recalled how his discovery of the park in the 1960s as a young adult, and his own attempts to find other gay men, would inspire him to work to change the situation for younger men. Helquist recalled, when I interviewed him, "When I was a teenager, I used to fantasize about someday discovering a community of other gay people in Saskatoon. After a long evening of walking the streets in the hopes of getting picked up, I would contemplate the possibility that I was the only gay person in Saskatoon. If I was to find a community of gay people, I'd have to move to Toronto or Vancouver. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I discovered that there indeed was a community of gay people in Saskatoon. At that time it was small, centered around house parties, or in the summer, the park. At last, here was a group of people who shared my experiences and could understand what I was feeling. It was an exciting discovery. Post-1970, with the creation of explicitly gay and lesbian membership clubs, and then gay and lesbian organizational and activist groups, gay and lesbian networks became more public. From 1970 to 1985, there was a dramatic expansion of spaces in which to be gay and lesbian in the prairies, and these are covers of 2 other newsletters. People responded enthusiastically to these new members-only clubs and the opportunities they presented for dancing, socializing, and meeting lovers, which were recalled by the participants as formative experiences. Many similarities were evident across the region. The clubs shared tactics. They encouraged visitors from outside the city and region with reciprocal membership cards. They exchanged newsletters, and staff and organizers met annually to refine the network. Eventually, all of these groups strove to start gay and lesbian lending libraries, to provide telephone information lines, perhaps later a counseling service. Each had a newsletter, and part of their motivation was to make their own club in their own particular city the best, part of a well-established regional rivalry amongst prairie cities. They're always jockeying who's the best at whatever thing, whether it's sports or volunteerism, what have you. In this case, they turned it to gay clubs. Which city had the best gay club? These social spaces were, as my narrators made clear, also political. They required people to self-identify, to join, and to participate. This was a crossroads that some discreet, privatized queer couples never managed to broach. They never managed to cross. But for others, a momentous development, and I'm going to share just one of many stories about this. In 1972, 38-year-old Evelyn Rogers and her 51-year-old partner, Lilia Stephenson, saw an ad for Regina's Odyssey Social Club in the local newspaper. Rogers recalled that Stephenson carried that ad around in her purse for months before they worked up the courage to call the telephone number and seek details. Eventually, they ventured out to the club. And what I didn't mention in the paper is that they had to be vetted before they went to the club. So they had to meet an intermediary, in this case, famous Canadian folk singer Heather Bishop, who was on the hook to answer these phone calls for the gay club. And so they went and they met Heather Bishop. She invited them in for tea. She verified they were indeed lesbians. Now they had their golden ticket. They could go in. So eventually, though, they found the club, they found the back door, the alley entrance, and they went up the stairs and went inside. Evelyn, who's written about this moment, said that it took a few shots of liquid courage before she could actually make it up those stairs. But, quote, "When we left that first night, we knew we would be back. We had officially come out." Once navigated, those evenings of socializing, solidarity, and sex were, as some recalled it, nothing short of revolutionary. But such steps were not without their costs, and in all the cities, the development of queer spaces and clubs would be met by backlash, violence, and repression. No amount of repression would hold back the bolder queers like Evelyn and Lilia, nor push them back into previous models of queer life marked by discretion and subterranean existence. I want to talk a little bit about those membership clubs now. There's a club membership card from Club Carousel. They're always very bureaucratic, so they actually did officially cancel your card when your membership ceased, lest you continue to sneak in. Creating membership clubs drew on a long history people had of living, working, and socializing in Western Canada. In the post-World War II era, thanks to new liquor legislation, which made it legal for women to drink in the newly created cocktail lounges, and expanded social spaces where alcohol could actually be served, there were renewed opportunities to carve out queer spaces in straight-run bars, hotels, restaurants, and cafes. Whether in famous landmark railway hotels, such as Saskatoon's Besborough Hotel, or Edmonton's Hotel Macdonald, which catered to travelers and businessmen in particular, or a range of urban hotels in various cities, more working class bars like Calgary's Cecil Hotel or Winnipeg's Mount Royal, Saskatoon's Apollo Hotel with moon-themed art on the wall. It was quite garish. Those spaces tended to predominantly attract more working class, students, and ultimately queer patrons to claim some public space in those venues. Claiming this space was not without controversy. It was routine occurrence, that police harassment took place or management changes would eject queers from some of these locals periodically. There'd just be some sort of managerial change and all of a sudden the gays were out of these bars. In Calgary, police harassment of queer patrons at the Cecil Hotel actually created the impetus for the city's first gay-owned space, the 620 Club, which was remembered, quote, as a nice little club for the braver of the gays to go to. Gay ownership, though, was not sufficient to protect patrons from harassment, as again, this place, the 620, was frequently visited by the police. Cars parked in the vicinity of the club were often towed away. License numbers were taken down. Which meant, according to this recollection, that many of the older professional people of our group were afraid to go. That club, the 620, was sold. Another club was opened at 1207 1st Street West. The second club, the 1207, was popular but short-lived. Finally, in 1970, gay and lesbian Calgarians launched their own membership club, Club Carousel, as a means to avoid police scrutiny and to provide safer space that they alone controlled. This organizational style, the membership club, was one of the hallmarks of early Western Canadian gay and lesbian organizing. As part of all their organizational goals, each group created newsletters to keep members updated on their events. In the first instance, because the local papers in Western Canada refused to print any information about gay and lesbian organizations because it was inappropriate to print that in the newspaper. Emblematic of the Alberta experience, though, the June 1973 issue of Carousel Capers came with this warning. This is a private newsletter, published by a private club. The contents are confidential. Names of members appear in the newsletters, and these individuals do not wish publicity. Readers were warned not to share the newsletter with straight friends because, I continue to quote, "Out of the closets and into the streets is a great battle cry for gays who don't have too much to lose. But then there are the rest of us." Alberta, Canada, is perhaps our most conservative province. It's the place that people always ask me about. What was it like to be gay in Alberta? They don't really care about Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But it was a very different place for queer people. Club newsletters in the other cities were less cautious, although they virtually all avoided mentioning members' names, which is important to point out, and they avoided identifying characteristics, which would be markedly different from the liberationist and cultural journals such as After Stonewall, Grassroots, and Voices that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, that were created only 4 or 5 years later. So we would see a real sea change between these membership newsletters and the more overt political grassroots and feminist activism that was in little news magazines like Carousel Capers. So what did they have in there? They had club events, they had city events, there were city directories, that were actually accurate. They weren't fictional. There were no maps. They had poems and little travelogues about going to cities in Western Canada, these sorts of things. So Calgary, Alberta, would be the first to adopt the membership club structure, but momentum and knowledge quickly built in the other cities. Edmonton, Alberta's capital city, followed with their own club, Club 70, that very same year. In Saskatoon, Jens Helquist was in discussions with older queer mentors like Dan Nelbach, an art historian at the University of Saskatchewan, about these developments in Calgary, as well as Nelbach's knowledge of, ironically, Buffalo, New York, where he was originally from, but also San Francisco and Vancouver. And that led the duo, Nelbach and Helquist, to place a classified ad in a Vancouver alternative journal trying to gauge interest in forming a Saskatoon gay club. Saskatoon's Zodiac Friendship Society, one part social club, one part gay activist organization, was launched in 1972. Now, Winnipeg would be a little bit different. in that Winnipeg's community was always split between their activists and their club membership, although most activists did attend the club, they did have members there. So Winnipeg's community would launch Happenings Social Club in 1970. It took 3 years of bureaucratic struggle and eventually a lawyer to get a charter because the province of Manitoba stalled them at every juncture in getting a charter. Charters were important because then you could have a liquor license. So Happenings was launched in 1970, but they don't get their charter until 1973, at the same time that queer students at the University of Manitoba, inspired by developments at the University of Minnesota, would launch the Campus Gay Club at the U of M, and later rename it Gays for Equality in 1972. So this is an image from the 1980s, when the Gays for Equality group would eventually create their own gay community center. And one of the reasons for that tension within the community was always about signage. Happenings refused to ever put anything that signified it was gay on their sign. Everyone knew it was gay, including the straights, but they would not put gay or lesbian on the sign. And the Gays for Equality people said, this is ridiculous. We need to have a gay center that actually says it's gay on the sign. So this is from 1980, Giovanni's room. Now, the image of the man seated at the table is interesting for two reasons. The first is that he's one of the co-creators of Giovanni's room, Richard North. He's one of the key gay liberationist activists in Winnipeg. But looking closely at the posters on the wall, one of those posters is for an event in Saskatchewan. And so it demonstrates the way in which there's all this cross-pollination within the region, people coming and going to various events. So they're very well aware of each other and what each other's doing. Regina, Saskatchewan's capital city, would not be outdone by Saskatoon, and they followed suit with their own Atropos Fellowship Society in late December 1972. Now, there were clear regional similarities here. Club managers and civic gay and lesbian leaders met frequently, initially for annual membership club conferences and later for activist conferences. Prairie gay and lesbian residents also traveled from club to club, eager to check them out, and with reciprocal entry privileges, it was very simple to do so. For all of the regional structural similarities, there were observable differences amongst the cities, though. Saskatoon was the most political. Winnipeg the most invested in education, religion, and media work. And Edmonton the place where counseling programs predominated, alongside a plethora of commercial bar space. Calgary was the most cautious of the cities, followed very closely by Regina, where many of my informants, my narrators, recall the paranoia about disclosing sexual identity. Regina, for those of you who don't know, is not only the Saskatchewan capital, but it's the training depot for the Royal Canadian Military Police. And many people who talked to me in Regina talked about the way in which the RCMP barracks there, like in a military town, casts a bit of a pall over Regina. And so it led to this very kind of privatized life there. Now, ironically, while very little political activity was organized by Regina, the club, this social club, became their focal point, and it alone survives of all of these membership clubs. It remains community-owned. It's had a series of names, and it proudly now is on one of the main downtown streets in Regina, flying the Pride rainbow flag very prominently outside that club. So it alone of all these membership clubs remains to this day. So I want to branch out now and talk a little bit about the 70s and 80s and the way in which in all of the cities, even in Regina for brief periods of time, you'd see an expansion, we saw an expansion of gay and lesbian services and organizations. So the organizations created in this time period, and some of them are on the maps, and of course I apologize for those of you at the back, you can't see the detail, but suffice to say you can see there's activity on there. There's not just one club, right? Organizations were created that branched out beyond social clubs with their drinks, dancing, and perhaps a teetotal coffee house night, to include organizations and programs devoted to educational, activist, religious, counseling, sports, lesbian feminist, men's groups, and cultural development. So they were very, very busy. Newsletters and periodicals retained their popularity, in large part because they were convenient, they were discreet, and they were highly coveted. Winnipeg would become an important leader in developing first radio programming for gays and lesbians, and then television programming. Winnipeg's Coming Out TV, which aired from 1980 to 1994, was an exceptional program, well ahead of its time. No other Canadian city would emulate this, and it would be the late 1990s before there would be dedicated gay programming on Canadian television packages for queer viewers. So Winnipeg is absolutely ahead of the curve. This happens in rather sort of typical prairie settler can-do fashion, in that the activists behind Winnipeg's Gays for Equality, all of 4 or 5 of them, turned a campus radio program into a television show for the simple reason that the campus radio show got canceled. And they thought, let's do TV. Now, Coming Out TV aired 800 new programs on the local Winnipeg cable TV station. 800. And this is thanks to a quirk in Canada's cultural laws, because in Canada, we're always very afraid of American cultural imperialism. And so Canada's cultural laws made it mandatory then that cable television providers had to agree to provide each city with its own local cable station. And on that local cable station, you had to have a certain criteria, a certain percentage of Canadian content. They didn't care what it was. That is why we have created the Canadian music industry in no small part, because again, these CanCon laws, all you had to have was a Canadian singer, producer, recorded in Canada, it's Canadian. So this local programming, I hope there's no Canadian musicians here, I always try to get through a talk without dissing someone, but invariably something like this happens. So this local programming in Winnipeg was really kind of fascinating. It's worthy of its own book in its own right. So Coming Out Television was welcomed by Channel 13 in Winnipeg because it helped them fulfill this criteria of Canadian content. It was a weekly news magazine show that featured local, national, and international queer notables. So every gay or lesbian author, playwright, academic, activist who came to the University of Manitoba, came to Winnipeg, came to the University of Winnipeg, appeared on Coming Out TV. If you were gay or lesbian and you went to Winnipeg, you were on that television program. As I said, originally they aired 800 original programs, and these were all broadcast in a supper hour time slot, so very convenient for everyone to watch. Those people I interviewed in Winnipeg told these wonderful stories of watching that show, which was then followed by a pair of elderly lesbians, sometimes wearing tuxedos, playing big band music in seniors' homes, which was, as I Googled this the other day, their name is the Cosmopolitans. I was tempted to play a little clip here today, but I knew I couldn't get through it without cracking up, so you'll have to watch it on your own. The Cosmopolitans were the longest running cable television show in Winnipeg. They were on the air for 20 years, playing music in seniors' homes, okay? Gives you a sense of the quality, perhaps, of cable television programming, and also the popularity, just the quirkiness of it all. So, with the exception of activist groups in all 3 cities, which remain limited to a very dedicated small core of gay men and lesbians, social, cultural, and gay media proved very popular in the 70s and 80s. Now, Winnipeg and Saskatoon's gay centers were relatively long-lived for these kind of volunteer-run organizations. And in fact, in the mid-1970s, Saskatoon's Gay Community Center was widely recognized across the country as one of the key gay and lesbian centers. Now, at the time that the Body Politic, based in Toronto, wrote an article about Saskatoon, it was only Saskatoon and Toronto that had a gay community center. So Saskatoon received a glowing write-up in the Body Politic about their accomplishments, the sort of little center that could, write up. And so it was clearly a surprise to journalists from Toronto, the Body Politic, to see what was going on in this very small, mid-sized prairie center. Vancouver activists were not shy, though, in their admiration, where Toronto was sort of, shock and awe, this exists. Vancouver activists in 1977 sent a delegation from Vancouver, BC, to Saskatoon to see for themselves what Saskatoon's community center offered, and whether or not Vancouver could replicate that model in their own city. A bit counterintuitive, and certainly not something that the previous literature ever captured, the way in which Vancouver would be emulating Saskatoon. In Winnipeg, Gays for Equality's media initiatives and their own prominence as an incubator and kickstarter for innumerable gay and lesbian groups and organizations would be very important to that city. In both cases, the fact that gay activists, key activists, remained in Winnipeg and Saskatoon for some time brought a sense of continuity that would be missing in a place like Edmonton and Calgary, as activists tended to come and go throughout the decades. Glenn Murray, who moved to Winnipeg in the 1980s and became a gay activist there, eventually the first gay mayor of any major Canadian city, recalled that people in places like Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, and Regina, etc., have had to build stronger communities outside of ghettos. I think there is a greater sense of inclusion within smaller gay communities because we cannot segregate ourselves. We have to be strong in a fragmented way. And I also think there's a greater sense of humanity about people in the prairies. We have to work together in isolation from larger centers. At the same time, Edmonton's gay organizational development was highly dependent on outsiders, those who came to work at the University of Alberta or in the various governmental and civil service capacities in Alberta, who then volunteered their time to assist gay activists in organizational development. And a number of them had, a couple of them were Americans, a couple of them were from Southern Ontario. The Americans had experience living in San Francisco, so they brought those models to Edmonton, which is important to note. Activism came and went through these 15 years and contained a variety of liberationist, progressive, and later human rights-based strategies. Resistance to queer visibility, and certainly anything smacking of activism or flaunting it, as their critics often labeled it, was persistent. In all cities, there was evidence of government or bureaucratic obstruction. The 3 years, for instance, it took for happenings to achieve their group charter. There were instances of university silences and shunning. Local renegades who took matters into their own hands, who launched arson attacks on the queer clubs, bashed gay men, and a handful of gay murders. Edmonton and Calgary police were oppositional. They often harassed the gay community, most notably in the bath raids in Edmonton in 1981. Saskatoon's police turned a blind eye to violence. They proved unable to catch arsonists, yet they were willing to issue parade permits for gay activist parades. There would be no parading in Alberta until the late 1990s, early 2000s, because of the culture of Alberta. So the fact that Winnipeg and Saskatoon had these gay parades in the 70s was very, very different than Alberta. Winnipeg's police seemed ill-equipped or unwilling to police the hill or cruising areas in the city, which led to numerous gay bashings. So how to account for these multiple differences in experience and outcome? Queer people learned to be careful, even in Saskatoon. Informants remembered going to the bar in groups, being prepared to make a quick entry or exit. In Edmonton, queer men characterized the experience of congregating in those early clubs to dance and socialize as akin to being outlaws. Notice the Western metaphor, outlaws. Such situations fostered identity, built political networks, even as some claimed all they wanted was space to socialize. It would be in the aftermath of American fundamentalist Christian and anti-gay activist Anita Bryant's tour throughout Western Canada and the gay bath raids in Edmonton in 1981 that the folly of accommodation and tolerance would be exposed for what it was, a risky proposition. This is an image from the Moose Jaw Times-Herald of the protest march that happened in Moose Jaw, very small city in Saskatchewan, protesting Anita Bryant's talk and concert that was actually a gift to the city for Canada Day from one of the fundamentalist Christian churches in the city. And there was a whole queer protest organized around it. Much as middle-class women in Western Canada learned that it was better to have the vote rather than influence, gay and lesbian activists, even those who adhered to older models of discreet and outward respectability, realized that such tactics would not protect them if a chinook of intolerance blew in. Having basic human rights would, or at the very least, it would give gay men and lesbians avenues to pursue justice. From 1970 to 1985, gay and lesbian activists in the prairies were well integrated into the Canadian movement, participating in conferences, periodicals, and organizations. At the same time, they demanded that their voices not merely support national top-down strategies, but that the movement be inclusive enough to allow for differences, notably lesbians and youth participation, but that it also recognized the importance of grassroots work and multiple approaches to identity politics. Doug Wilson, a Saskatchewan-born activist whose discrimination case against the University of Saskatchewan in 1975 brought him national media attention in Canada and launched his activist career, would be one of Saskatoon's key promoters of grassroots activism throughout rural areas and small towns. He was like an evangelist for gay activism. Wilson and lesbian activist Kay Bierwheeler created the Saskatchewan Gay Coalition in 1977. And in doing so, they reached out to Regina activists in an attempt to offer provincial educational, activist, and social support to gay and lesbian residents in small towns and rural areas. And they literally did go invite all the known gay and lesbian residents in those small communities to meet them in hotel rooms where they screened films that they brought around. The Word Is Out, a popular American film in the 70s, was screened this way in many of these small towns. And it was quite a risky endeavor because for those of you unfamiliar with Western Canada, many of these small towns have a small hotel. It has the local beer parlor or beverage room, and so to go to this hotel, to some outside Saskatoon guy's hotel room and watch a film and talk about being gay was really an act of courage on the part of some of these individuals that lived there. And it was not uncommon for Wilson to receive a lot of letters after his trip saying, you know, that evening I was just too busy, I couldn't get around to it, work was too intense, I couldn't come, but please tell me everything that happened and who was there, their names, their addresses, I want to know these people. So, you know, one small 4-person, 6-person, 3-person meeting at a time, they were trying to spread the word about being gay, being lesbian, and being activists in these rural areas. So it's quite interesting what they were up to. As part of their work, their educational work, they created the periodical Grassroots, which was an important facet of, as I said, their work. In 1982, Grassroots finished its 4-year print run. It had 2,100 subscribers. It had started with something ridiculous, like 57 subscriptions that they mailed out. Every single person they knew in Saskatchewan that was gay, they sent them one of these little newsletters. And it just snowballed through, ultimately, 4 years later, 2,100 subscribers across the Prairie West, Northwestern Ontario, and the American Midwest, all subscribing to Gay Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan Gay Coalition was a feminist organization with the decision-making shared equally between gay men and lesbians, another important facet of this coalition. Now, another important outcome of, this is a little bit out of order, sorry. One outcome of Saskatchewan Gay Coalition was the creation of the Prairie Gay and Lesbian Cultural Festival called Metamorphosis. First held in October 1978, Metamorphosis drew over 200 people for its first iteration. People came from across the Prairie region for a 3-day festival of, quote, laughter, loving, dancing, singing, arts, crafts, photography, music, theater, books, film, poetry, good food, good company, women loving women, men loving men, sharing, building, growing, flaunting, and much more. Flaunting it and much more. Now again, it was covered by the Body Politic. Reporters from Toronto's Body Politic described it as a total high-energy weekend, stronger than Toronto's Gay Days celebrations. I'm hard on Toronto in this book. I'm from Toronto, so don't feel sorry for them. Musical performers came to Metamorphosis from Vancouver and from San Francisco, drawing on some of Doug Wilson's own personal networks. And while the event changed over time, becoming more and more focused on lesbian culture, music, and activism, Metamorphosis would continue to attract hundreds of attendees until 1989. It ceased operations in that year due to volunteer burnout, even though attendance remained strong. It may appear, given the brief focus on key Saskatoon events, that Doug Wilson was the only activist in Saskatoon, but that was not accurate. He was joined by Jens Helquist, Neil Richards, Beth Foster, Weesia Kolsinka, and others during his time in the city. As I've argued in other articles I've written, one in particular about Doug Wilson, Wilson's vision and charisma were important to the city, and also important was his networking with other regional activists. such as the After Stonewall crew, who would move from Winnipeg, Manitoba to Saskatoon because Saskatoon was seen as having such a politically open vibe. But Wilson also worked with Calgary activists. Doug Wilson met Doug Young. It's the 1970s and 80s. Everybody's called Doug in Western Canada. I'm sorry. Doug Wilson met Doug Young, Calgary's leading gay activist. So I'll go back to the former slide. Young was involved with Gay Information Resources Calgary. That Perceptions magazine is launched in 1984. And one of the interesting issues about Perceptions, which runs right until 4 years ago when it ceased publication, is the large amount of kind of Western art that links Western region with gayness, which is quite interesting. So Doug Wilson met Doug Young, Calgary's leading gay activist and the head of the Gay Information Resources Calgary, while they were planning that protest in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan against Anita Bryant. During those sessions, Young and Wilson bonded about their shared vision for gay rural politics and their admiration for rural and small-town queer people. Both of them were from farms. A close friend of Young's remembered that, quote, "You might almost call Wilson and Young the agrarians of the gay rights leadership." This same individual said that he recalled Doug Wilson saying, "One day, we'll take our grain to the pool elevator, gas up at the co-op, and go 10 miles down the road to the Gopher Gulch Gay Saloon." That was the dream. The image of two pioneer-era same-sex couples used on gay Saskatchewan covers, or grassroots covers, but also on the Saskatchewan Gay Coalition motto, is a political statement. It seeks to reclaim both a rural, but also a gay rural history of the prairies, because these are the sort of classic, iconic, rural Anglo settlers that came to the prairies, recast as two queer couples. Another important publication was Voices, a survival manual for women. Voices focused on women's health of body, mind, and spirit. And the purpose behind this periodical was to provide a forum for sharing information, ideas, experiences, skills, and dreams. The collective that produced the magazine included coordinator Isabel Andrews, her partner Doreen Warden, and for the first few issues, Yvette Parr. Warden and Andrews had met in Winnipeg in 1975 when the 41-year-old Warden came out as a lesbian. In the city, they'd been actively involved in feminist groups, lesbian feminism, and labor activism, particularly at Winnipeg's Women's Place. But in 1978, burnt out and frustrated, they set out, quote, on a healing journey to Rabbit Lake near Kenora, Ontario, in the province's northwestern corner. I'll continue the quote. "Moving out of the city, fighting addictions, learning about herbs and reflexology, healing rituals, and becoming more politicized were, quote, their goals for going off-grid in Canadian Shield country. In their press release, they indicated that for too long, cities have absorbed most of our lesbian energy, but in some parts of this continent, the trend is now beginning to reverse. There, on their own land near Kenora, they hope to restore their health, cultivate their lesbian feminist ideals, and politicize the issue of rural lesbians." Now, along with this periodical, Voices, which had subscribers across Canada in rural areas, they founded the Lesbian Archives of Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario, called LARC. LARC was intended to preserve the histories of rural and Western experiences, with particular emphasis on Winnipeg organizations and women's healing. Unfortunately, neither their newsletter nor their archives survived beyond 1980 due to financial challenges. Unlike Grassroots, which could claim that their subscription base and the people who assembled for their small town meetings were growing, albeit modestly, Andrews and Warden had challenges doing outreach in northwestern Ontario. In 1981, Andrews expressed frustration about the sexism and homophobia they faced. In an article entitled "A Plea to Gay Women in Kenora and Elsewhere," Andrews wrote that Voices was, quote, "the first and only and last publication that will ever come out of what has been called the Alabama of Canada." She had to admit that they had not been too successful at finding lesbians in and around Kenora because, she said, we are too far out of the closet for the boys that make the rules of the games around here and for the women who support them. Frustrated with their lack of progress in Kenora, she shared how they wrote, quote, to save our own sanity and hopefully, in the process, help someone else save theirs. They urged their readers to write in and share their stories, their coping mechanisms, to break the silence, and some women did write to this periodical. It's clear that the rural retreat was beginning to wear on them, as they realized it might be possible to escape the politics and sexism of Winnipeg, but such sexism was manifested differently in smaller towns and rural areas, and outsiders might be viewed as suspicious for a host of reasons. And this is an important point to make. Many of the most successful rural lesbians or gay people living in rural areas of the prairies were from those places. People would routinely describe them as one of our own. And if you were one of our own, they would make accommodation for you. If you were an outsider, like this pair, you might find it to be a rocky road. And I will read their quote about what they experienced. We understand why our existence threatens you. We also understand that you are just about to go round the bend as often as we are, because of the very high level of prejudice here that daily threatens our sanity, to say nothing of threatening our ability to keep on loving. We insist in our own right to shout to our very last breath, and this is all in capital letters. I will not shout though. We are good. We are whole. We are beautiful. We deserve better than this. We plead with you to join us. When one works with alternative periodicals, as some of you in the room know, one seldom finds a completed collection. And unfortunately, this is the last issue I found of Voices, so I don't know what happens to them after this story. The archival trail for me has gone dead, but apparently the magazine existed for another year. I want to offer some concluding comments so that there's time for us to have some questions, some dialogue and discussion. Prairie gay and lesbian activists did not believe that moving to a central metropolis was the only avenue to mature gay or lesbian identity, activist work, or life. They argued for the viability of small-town queer lives, recognized that this would look different than what was feasible in a big city or queer ghetto, and tried to establish ways for prairie women and men to be proud queer people living, working, and loving in the prairies. Some, they knew, would move on in search of larger opportunities, but many, they realized, wanted to be both gay and Western, lesbian and rural, and providing resources, spaces, organizations, and cultural groups acknowledge people's rights to be gay and lesbian in their home region. When interviewed, Edmonton activist Liz Messiah, who was originally from Ontario, spoke about the phenomenon of people returning to the prairies because they actually miss the culture there. Messiah recalled, I think it's part of that prairie mentality where out here it can be pretty brutal. We got to stick together. I've had lots of people who I know who've gone to Vancouver and said the community is not nearly as welcoming. They come back here, they like our community better. I know we've seen tremendous change. Being an activist, I've learned the importance of politics. Like it or not, it makes a difference. I want to make a comment about this image, Winnipeg, One Gay City. This is a rethinking of Golden Boy, who's on top of the Manitoba legislature. A very cute story about an activist who moved from Winnipeg to Toronto, who had just assumed that queer cruising grounds were always denoted by Golden Boy, and so when he got to Toronto, very naively, was looking for Toronto's version of Golden Boy, and of course couldn't find him because he's a Western Canadian Winnipeg icon. He's not to be found anywhere else in the world. In 1985, it would be AIDS that conclusively changed the activist terrain in the prairies. This epidemic and the fear that it caused galvanized a wide-ranging number of queer people towards activism and support. It also removed the blinders from those mainstream residents who had persisted or willfully ignored the queer people in their midst. Deaths could not be ignored. Lesbians and gay men threw themselves into AIDS advocacy and support groups, vocally demanded that reluctant conservative provincial governments provide funding for research and educational campaigns. Getting little buy-in, they designed their own safe-sex campaigns. They founded health organizations. They worked to assist those living with AIDS. My research concludes in 1985 as that AIDS-related campaign began, in large part because it marked the end of one cycle of activism and organizational activity and the beginning of another. These histories of queer communities, politics, and resistance are not sequential. They're not linear. But as we collect more documents, oral and print, as we write more inclusive histories, it's my hope that we not forget the queer people, communities, and organizations in the prairies who've made extensive contributions to this region. In the end, a small band of volunteers working against some insurmountable odds put their shoulder into working to make queer lives possible, and then, having established basic social and community structures, to working for changes. There were very few funds, handfuls of people in each city, but what they lacked in funding and capacity, they made up for in drive and determination. Barb Clay, one of the organizers of Saskatoon's Metamorphosis, attributed this voluntary spirit to a regional ethos. And when I interviewed her, she said, "Generally, the prairies are strong in volunteerism. Saskatoon's got to be right up there as one of the best in the country for volunteering, whether it's curling or Grey Cup or lesbian and gay community. We all just pitch in. If you want something done, there aren't many dollars behind it. Well, it gets done by volunteers, and that certainly worked very well for us. Unfortunately, it tends to be the same volunteers." Prairie lesbians and gay men knew initially that the odds were not in their favor, but they brought political, social, and cultural ideas of gay communities and activism to the region, and they tailored that message for prairie residents. The irony in all of this is that they drew upon prairie norms of volunteerism, a rather pragmatic, at times unflappable approach to achieving what appeared to be impossible goals, and a strong sense that though small and isolated from larger queer centers, it was fully within their abilities to strive to achieve space, organization, and later activism, geared to making life better for gays and lesbians in the prairies. In the words of Gays for Equality, to love and let love. The communities were never as united as these recollections may suggest, but few communities of any sort, whether ethnic, gendered, religious, class, or political, ever are. The influence of Saskatchewan's Gay Coalition's grassroots campaign, their support for queer people in small towns, mid-sized cities, and rural areas, spoke volumes about the importance attached to place, sexuality, and identity. Toward gay community, the slogan of the 1977 conference in Saskatoon, with its rather unique, for gay activism, patchwork image of a prairie field, co-opted a familiar prairie agricultural image to symbolize regional gay and lesbian activism. Sums up the difference of queer activism in the Prairie West. These and other groups drew upon national and international developments in gay politics, and culture, and activism, and then they tailored them, they refined them to fit the local context. Queer people's struggles to take lovers, to carve out lives in social spaces are important, because they offer us insights into active resistance, accommodations, tolerance, and acceptance in the prairies. The stereotype of the prairie region as a bleak, persistently homophobic place, scarred by violence and police persecution, has some basis in fact, but queer men and women were not merely victims of a region noted for valorizing nuclear families, faith, and farming. Larger prairie cities provided queer refuge. This research challenges the preconceived narratives of queer history, of the connections between the local, the national, and the international, and demonstrates how more nuanced, urban, regional studies can enrich our histories of what liberation looked like, not only beyond London, but beyond New York, San Francisco, and Toronto. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Valerie, for a fascinating lecture on prairies, lesbian and gay activism. Now we've got time for a few questions to Valerie if you want to indicate. I'm laughing because I'm going to give the first slot to Justin, who comes from the same region, I believe.
I know, I think I might be the only person that this is where I was born and raised, so this is really, really a treat. Thank you so much for writing this history, Valerie.
You're welcome.
I was two questions actually. I'm wondering about archives and how much Prairie Queer History Archives remain on the Prairie, or how much has been relocated to Gay and Lesbian Archives in Toronto.
Well, interestingly, a lot of Prairie queer material remains in the Prairies for a couple of reasons. The first is that we've had a huge collector based in Saskatoon, Neil Richards, who has created this fantastic archives. It's one of the major archival collections I used for the book. And so Neil basically attended every group that happened in Saskatoon from 1971 when he moved to Saskatoon until yesterday, and has donated them to the Saskatchewan Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan. He's also donated them to the University of Saskatchewan Archives. Neil took a 2-year leave from work to work at the Canadian Lesbian Gay Archives. And so the reason they have Prairie documents there is because Neil actually took photocopies to them and put Prairie material there. But they have the photocopies, we have the originals. One of the great facets of these organizations is that they shared all their materials back and forth. So Neil was involved in every group in Saskatoon, and so he kept all those newsletters and posters and things like that was going on. So there's a huge repository there in Saskatchewan. We have the second largest gay and lesbian holdings in the country after Toronto. But Alberta has a very large holding in Edmonton based on all the Edmonton groups, all the Winnipeg groups, including every single video of coming out television exists in Manitoba, at the University of Manitoba Archives. So most of it remains in the region. You know, in no large part, it's because Toronto and Vancouver, while claiming national or regional prominence, often are just not interested in what went on in the prairies. There's this sense of, well, you know, not much happened there, so some guy brought in some documents and that must be good enough. So the material remains in the home region that generated it, which is quite lucky for us.
And the second part of my question actually is building on Alan's paper this morning on the Matelots and the military presence there. And I was wondering, when you were talking about Regina, the issue of having so many Mounties about it, there's a sexual culture around the RCMP. And because I'd come across a collection of photos of one of my great uncles that was his gentleman friends, included which was a sort of what I call the sultry Mountie.
Yes.
And I wonder if there's more to that than my little find.
There is. You know, that I have to say that the collection, the Neil Richards collection and the others are absolutely vast. And so in some respects, my work is just, you know, covering the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge submerged iceberg that I haven't been able to get at in my attempt to give sort of this regional portrait of all these cities. So not only is there important work that could be done with the RCMP and some, you know, episodic cases within the RCMP, but there's important work to be done on the military bases. So a couple of the women I interviewed in Saskatoon had really fond memories of driving to Edmonton for the weekend, which is not uncommon in Saskatoon. People go to Edmonton for the weekend because it's only 4.5 hours away and it's a much bigger city, and so they go for shopping and theater and, you know, all kinds of things. But there were various army bases there, and there was a well-known sort of lesbian group of women, lesbian campers, for lack of something more sophisticated to say about them, who every summer just kind of, you know, camped at these various campsites around Edmonton, and so attracted women in the know from the prairies who would drive out there for some of these camping weekends. So there's a lot of really interesting work that could be done. Calgary is now doing a very unique community-based project, the Calgary Queer History Project, really finding some interesting stuff, doing some oral interviews, trying to collect some data and some documentation in Calgary. And so they're worth Googling because they've got some really neat stuff going on there. Thank you.
Right, I see 2 more questions, well 3 actually. If I take all 3 questions and then Valerie can answer them, and then that would be great. So starting with you at the back.
So I love this work.
Thank you.
At the same time, I want to question the sort of the heteronormativity of the terms, right? So you say they didn't have a parade yet, as though a parade, which is an urban function, defines, you know, quality gay life. And so I just wanted to take this opportunity, a rare one, to think about how truckers who do not identify as gay, and are my research, and I'm talking about it tomorrow, right? But how truckers bring gay sex to all the places we talk about, right? Anyone who's been in a rural area, a farming area, an industrial area, knows that truckers bring sex, male-male sex, female-female sex, trans, straight sex, all that, to everywhere. And they don't ever identify as gay, like they never join these groups, ever. But that their behavior is such a crucial part of gay life and of life in general in all of these places. And I could think of the mounted police. I mean, like trucker sex and sexuality and, you know, military and mounted. And so just sort of thinking about who are we looking at when we look at gay people? If we're only looking at people who identify with these terms, we're leaving out a lot of people who are doing like fun, radical, queer stuff where they are too.
You're going to take the questions and then I'll comment, or can I answer?
Unless
them?
you want to.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for that opportunity to say that I'm summarizing a 500-page manuscript in 40 minutes, so I left a bit out. So that gives me the opportunity to say that I did actually interview people who don't really identify as gay. And I agree with you. That's one of the challenges of the current literature, is that we tend to talk only to the people who are comfortably queer or volunteer to talk to us or identify. But I've been very influenced by John Howard's work in the United States about men who have sex with men and their various perspectives on what that is, including just sex. And so, yes, I have those people in Western Canada, and I have them in the book, including a whole cohort of women in Saskatoon who live openly but privatized lesbian lives. They refuse to use that term. They refuse to out themselves, but they've all lived. There's about 15 or 20 of them. I call them the campus lesbians. One of them spoke to me anonymously, and it's a really rich interview. The way in which they just have created this space for themselves that is both not in the community, not lesbian, living in the same city. Everybody knows who they are. People presume they're lesbian, but as the woman said to me in the interview, and this is a woman in her 70s, early 70s when we spoke, she said, you know, until I tell you I'm a lesbian, even though she's lived with the same partner for, 25, 30 years, you can't presume to put that label on me. You've got to wait for me to tell you that. And we click the tape off. I say, thank you very much. What a great interview. I can't use a lot of it because of the small nature of the community, and she was involved in some prominent activities.